Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, My System. The customary quote, "Whoever is happy will make others happy too." From the German-Dutch diarist Anne Frank. A brief review of the last part where we continued our study of Chapter 9, the pawn chain, and discussed the concepts of blockade rules applied to the chain and war of movement or siege warfare with illustrations given by Nimzowitsch. We also went through game number 46 of the illustrative game section as advised by Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further into the book, Nimzowitsch begins the next part of the discussion under the following heading. Number 5a, Positional Warfare, the slow siege of the unprotected base. Repeated bombardment. The defending pieces get in one another's way. How can we maintain the pressure? The genesis or origins of new weaknesses. The base as a weakness in the endgame. Nimzowitsch continues, and now to return to the position discussed previously. Since in the position shown on board, the move Bishop d7 seems to give little promise of profit, Black, as we have several times insisted, had much better have played c takes on d4. What does this move signify? The white base pawn at d4 has thereby been made immobile, has been fixed at d4. Before c takes on d4 took place, white's d-pawn could, whether for good or evil, at any rate, leave their place by d takes on c5. But this is no longer possible. We must be quite clear on one point, that by playing c takes on d4, Black has had to resign themselves to renouncing their ambitious dreams of forcing their opponent into complete capitulation in the chain area. These are now gone to the grave. But Black does retain certain small yet real possibilities. For instance, White's pawn at d4 will be attacked by several pieces. Not so much for the reason that the conquest of White's base is likely, but rather in order to force upon the defending enemy pieces a passive because purely defensive role. Black's aim is in fact an ideal one, the advantage of the aggressive position for Black's pieces as discussed previously. The continuation could be c takes on d4, c takes on d4, and bishop d7, threatening knight takes on d4, which of course could not be done before because of knight takes on d4, knight takes on d4, queen takes on d4, and bishop b5 check, winning the black queen. So bishop d7 and a bishop e2. If a bishop c2 instead, Black could obtain the two bishops with knight b4. As such, bishop e2 and knight e7. Whether it be slow or quick, Black chooses the development which puts pressure on the base, and rightly, for in close games, those characterized by the presence of pawn chains, the chain is the one true guidepost. b3, knight f5, bishop b2, and bishop b4 check. This check shows up and in the most glaring light, so to say, the dark side of an enforced defense by many pieces. The defending pieces are in one another's way. King f1, for either knight c3 or knight d2 would rob the base of a defender. So king f1 and bishop e7, Tarash's idea. The student should ponder the argument on which this move is based. If they are to keep up the pressure on white's pawn at d4, black must never allow the equilibrium of attack and defense, now 3 versus 3, to be disturbed to their disadvantage. The attacking pieces must strive to maintain their attacking positions. To effect this, h5 could be played instead of bishop e7 to prevent g4. The text move bishop e7 attains the same end by other means. If now g4, the answer would be knight h4. An attacker, the black knight, and a defender, the white knight, would disappear together and the status quo would be maintained. The typical strategy appropriate to the various cases which may arise is made clear by the following postulates. A. The enemy base being fixed to one spot should be attacked by several pieces. B. By these means, we shall at least obtain the ideal advantage of the aggressive position for our pieces. Worth mentioning in this connection is the slight elasticity or capacity for maneuvering possessed by the defending pieces. For instance, in the case of a sudden attack on the other wing, they will not be able to equal the attacking pieces in the rapidity of motion and will lag behind. C. We must seek to keep up the pressure on the base for as long as possible, at any rate until the appearance of new weaknesses in the enemy camp, which will follow as the logical consequence of the enemy's difficulties in development. D. When this occurs, our plan of action will be modified. The original weakness, the base, will be let alone, the new one attacked with the greatest energy, and only much later, perhaps not until the end game, will the weak enemy base be again promoted to the dignity of being our objective. E. The weak base is, when all is said and done, to be regarded as, in particular, an endgame weakness. Since the specific attacking instrument, the open adjoining file, in this case the C file, only comes completely into its rights in the endgame. Rook c4 followed by rook takes on d4, or rook c2 to d2 followed by rook takes on d4. F. The attacking party must never forget that they on their side have a base to defend as well. If their opponent succeeds in making their part of the chain region healthy, that is, in shaking off the pressure on their base, the pawn at d4 in our case, an entirely new and disagreeable turn may be given to the game by their playing f4, f5, with attack on the base, pawn at e6. Or on the other hand, launching an attack with their pieces on the king's position, which is cramped by white's pawn at e5. The application of postulate A will hardly present any difficulties to the student. Take for instance the position on board. The chain we have to do with is formed of E and D pawns on both sides. Black's base is the pawn at D6. White now plays C takes on D4, C takes on D4, Rook C6, Knight F7, Knight C4 and Rook D8. If Rook C8 instead, then B5, Rook takes on C6 and D takes on C6 with a superior endgame for white. As such, Rook D8 and A4 to maintain the attacking knight at C4 on this square. White has now put the base pawn at D6 under pressure and consequently has the advantage referred to of the more aggressive position for his pieces. The knight at C4 is more aggressively placed than Black's knight at F7 and so on. This advantage could be exploited either by B5 followed by, say, King C3 and A5, or by play on the king's wing, H4 and then King E3 to F3 to G4 to H5, followed by G4, G5. When the parry H6 by Black would allow the king's entry at G6. It is much more difficult for the student to assimilate or understand the points made in C and D. The direct exploitation of a pawn weakness is not, properly speaking, a matter for the middle game. See point E. All that we may hope to attain is to cause our opponent to suffer for a considerable period under the disadvantage of the duties of defense which have been forced on them. If, as a result of these difficulties, a new weakness be induced in the enemy camp, as is by no means improbable, it is not merely permissible, or in other words, it is a good idea for the attacking party to release the base from pressure in order to devote their attention to the new weakness. Such a course is absolutely indicated. The further removed geographically and logically the two weaknesses are from one another, the better for us. This connection of ideas was more or less unknown to the pseudo-classical school. Tarrasch, for instance, was wont with relentless persistence to keep under continual attack the base which he had once selected as his objective, or at least to remain true to wing of his first choice. See game number 19 of the illustrative game section, Paulsen versus Tarrasch. Please note, we shall go through this game in its entirety in the next part of the video series. Nimzowitsch continues. In opposition to this, we lay stress on the principle that the weakness of the enemy base cannot be completely exploited until the endgame, as mentioned previously in point E. Or more accurately, in the endgame, our aim is the direct, that is to say, actual conquest of the base, which serves as our objective. In the middle game, the bombardment of this base can and should only help to yield us indirect advantages. For example, suppose Black to be attacking the enemy base in the middle game, White's pieces will get in one another's way. Difficulties of development will arise, and white will find themselves forced to create a new weakness in their own camp. In order to remove those difficulties, on this, black now concentrates their attack, and only in the end game may black find it profitable to take up again the attack on their first objective, the enemy base. As an example of this indirect exploitation of a weakened enemy base, we may study the position shown on board taken from game number 19 of the illustrative game section, Paulson versus Tarrasch. After the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, bishop d3, c takes on d4, c takes on d4, bishop d7, knight, bishop e2, knight e7, b3, knight f5, bishop b2, and bishop b4 check. White saw themselves forced to forego castling by having to play king f1. Thus, the pressure on white's pawn at d4 has taken tangible shape. Black's problem therefore no longer consists in keeping up the pressure on the d pawn, which could be done by h5 or bishop e7, as we have already indicated previously. Black should rather give up the attack on white's base and do everything they can to expose and exploit the weakness of white's king at f1. This indeed is only possible by means of a hidden sacrifice of the exchange. In this position, in reply to king f1, I play castling. If then bishop d3, to lessen the pressure on the d pawn, there would follow f6, bishop takes on f5, e takes on f5 with advantage to black in their two bishops. The main variation after king f1 and castling lies in the continuation g4. Knight h6, rook g1, f6, e takes on f6, rook takes on f6, g5, rook takes on f3, bishop takes on f3, or g takes on h6 and rook f7. So bishop takes on f3, knight f5 and rook g4. White's desolate king's wing and the weakly defended points in the f file ought, in my opinion, to lead to a lost game. I give one possible continuation. Bishop e8. Rook f8 instead is also good enough. But bishop e8, queen e2, knight takes on d4, rook takes on d4, knight takes on d4, and queen e5, the last chance. Bishop e5 check, king g2, knight f5, bishop takes on d5. If instead knight c3, then bishop takes on c3, bishop takes on c3, d4, and so on. So bishop takes on d5, e takes on d5, queen takes on f5, rook f8, queen takes on d5 check, and rook f7. A self pin for the purpose of safeguarding g7 against a possible queen d4. Queen d4, bishop c5, and white must resign. The decision took place as was logical on the king's wing. The second player, or black, was able to exploit to the full the new weakness without any regard to the old one. The student will do well to note most carefully the transfer of the attack from the center, the base pawn at d4, to the king's wing, which had been weakened by king f1. The transfer called for a resolute attacking play. As an antithesis or opposition to the maneuver we have just demonstrated, we would emphasize the fact in the position on board that bishop e7 after g3 and king g2 to follow, with the subsequent safeguarding and relieving of the pawn at d4, would give white good chances, for after their position had been consolidated, white would be well able to turn the tables on their opponent as outlined in point F previously, by an attack on black's king wing, which is cramped by the pawn at e5. See game number 20 of the illustrative games section, Nimzowitsch versus Tarrasch. Please note we shall go through this game towards the end of the video series along with other remaining games of the illustrative games section of the book. Nimzowitsch continues, before we proceed further, we impress upon the student that they should practice so as to be able to take advantage of a weak enemy base in the end game. We recommend the study of game number 15 of the illustrative games section and further the application of the following method. Set up a pawn chain on the board, for example, the position on board, and try to take advantage of the weakness of white's pawn at d4 in an endgame with rooks on board or a rook and a minor piece on each side. Alright, let's go through game number 15 of the illustrative games section of the book as recommended by Nimzowitsch. The game was played between Aron Nimzowitsch versus Sergey Nikolaevich von FREYMANN, please excuse my pronunciation, in the Vilnius All-Russian Masters tournament in 1912, played at Vilnius, Lithuania, then the Russian Empire. FREYMANN was a Russian Uzbekistani chess master who played around the turn of the 20th century. Nimzowitsch with the white pieces and FREYMANN with the black. Notes by Aron Nimzowitsch. e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, knight f3 and c takes on d4, where Nimzowitsch comments, queen b6 instead seems to be better for black. So c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight c6, knight takes on c6, d takes on c6, bishop d3, queen c7, bishop f4 and g5. Nimzowitsch writes, not quite sound but leading to interesting play. The resulting position is discussed later in part 2 of the book, Position Play. Bishop g3, bishop g7, queen e2, knight e7, castling h5, h3, knight f5 and bishop h2. Nimzowitsch writes, instead, bishop takes on f5, e takes on f5, and e6 would be obviously bad because of f4. E takes on f7 check, and king takes on f7. As such, bishop h2 and g4. The pretty point of the attack started by g5. Rook e1. The answer to h takes on g4, h takes on g4, and queen takes on g4 would have been rook takes on h2, king takes on h2, and bishop takes on e5 check, followed by bishop takes on b2. So rook e1, king f8, and knight c3. The knight proposes to make their way to f4 after the black knight at f5 is exchanged off. Queen e7, bishop takes on f5, e takes on f5, queen e3, rook h6, knight e2, c5, and knight f4. Nimzowitsch writes, this knight is to be regarded as primarily the blockader of black's pawn at f5 and its adherent mass of pawns. But in addition, this knight acts as an anti-blockader for their own aspiring pawn at e5. d4, queen d3, queen d7, queen c4, queen c6, and h takes on g4. Nimzowitsch remarks, the necessary prelude to knight d3. If at once knight d3, there would have followed g takes on h3, queen takes on c5 check, queen takes on c5, knight takes on c5, rook g6, g3, and white stands badly. So h takes on g4 first, bishop a6, queen d5, queen takes on d5. Nimzowitsch writes, most interesting would have been h takes on g4 instead of queen takes on d5. The result would have been a triumphant march of the e-pawn to e8. For instance, h takes on g4, h takes on g4, e6 with attack on the black queen, queen takes on d5, e7 check, king e8, and knight takes on d5, followed by check at c7, the unexpected advance of the unstopped pawn. But queen takes on d5 was played in the game, and play continued with knight takes on d5 and bishop c4. Nimzowitsch comments, if instead h takes on g4, then again e6, winning the exchange. So bishop c4, knight f6, h takes on g4, bishop f4, rook g6, knight d7 check, and white won the c-pawn, and after 20 further moves, the game. What interests in the above game is above all the role with the knight at f4, which the knight at f4 has played. As a blockader, the knight was strongly posted and excellently supported by the bishop at h2. Again, the knight had a crippling effect on black's bishop at g7 and rook at h6, and so on. Further, the knight's threat effect was considerable, particularly on the points d5 and e6. The mobility of white's e-pawn affords a piquant or pleasant antithesis to the immobility of black's pawn at f5. And lastly, the knight's elasticity was striking, for the knight could composedly go on their travels, leaving the bishop to take their place. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here, and we shall continue onwards from the next part. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. Several new supporters: Last Miles, arsenalfanrichi, zwebchess, Unrated Chess, hypeprofessor, and Johnny D. Last Miles is Dennis Clark, a chess enthusiast, and he also streams science and technology, specifically coding and computing machinery and so on. I will post a link to his stream in the video description. Do check him out. arsenalfanrichi is Richard Smith, a strong chess player from UK. Unrated Chess and Johnny D are both fellow chess streamers as well. I will post a link to their streams in the video descriptions as well. Do check them out. Thanks a lot for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.